Okay, so I'm here today at the ARC conference, and one of its themes, perhaps with the notable exception of Donald Trump's America, is that conservatism and conservatives are under threat all over the world, and nowhere more so than South Africa. And that's why I'm very pleased to be joined by Rob Hersov, who is a South African businessman and an outspoken critic of the ruling ANC. So welcome to The Sceptic, Rob.
Thank you, Laurie. Great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. Okay, and so, well, before we get into, well, you're going to tell us a bit about South Africa today, but tell us a bit about your background as a businessman and how you became, this outspoken critic of the present ruling regime.
I'm born in South Africa in 1960, a fifth-generation South Africans, my mother's side from England and Scotland, my father's side from Eastern Europe and Russia. And I did all my education in South Africa up to university and then military service. And then I left the country, left South Africa in 1985, went to America, Goldman Sachs, Harvard Business School, worked as Rupert Murdoch's right-hand man, came to Europe from America and was on the board of Richemont. I had a very corporate career up till my mid-30s, late 30s, when I became an entrepreneur. And I spent 31 years in Europe, America, and the UK, and then decided to return to South Africa in late 2016, because I felt it was the last chance for my younger children, my wife, who's from New Zealand, to see South Africa before Jacob Zuma and the ANC destroyed the country. And the country had begun its downward spiral, rapid downward spiral under Jacob Zuma. But 8 years later, I'm still in South Africa and committed to stay there. And 3.5 years ago, I was invited to make a speech at a business conference. And there were only 200 people in the room because of COVID, 50 and 50, the divider. And I made a very, very strong speech calling out the ANC and saying South Africa is uninvestable under the ANC.
South Africa is not investable. It really isn't. From an international perspective, from an FDI perspective, international money would be insane to invest in South Africa right now.
And I named names and I really called them out in a meaningful way. And when the video was released 10 days later, that was the beginning of a whole new life for me. It changed my life. I could never return to what I was before. And I was an accidental activist. And once, as a white man in Africa calling out a government, you survive the racist card, because many of my black-colored Indian friends, including members of government, ANC government, said, you may not like him, you may not like what he says, but he's not a racist. Once you survive the racist card, I then, as the American expression goes, double down. And I've been speaking out for the last 3.5 years. I'm calling out the government.
Okay, and so that's South Africa as it is now. And of course, South Africa was, kind of a cause célèbre in the Western world in the late 20th century with the pressure put on it to end apartheid. And it's kind of more fallen out of the Western thought process, really, I think, in the past 30 years, more so. So give us just a bit of a brief history of South Africa since apartheid came down.
So in 1985, the apartheid nationalist government had their Damascene moment. America and the West had put very heavy sanctions on South Africa, and including sporting sanctions. And the government decided that keeping apartheid was unsustainable in 1985. In 1994, we had our first democratic elections, and the ANC swept the board. They got 95% of the province's municipality and country. And Nelson Mandela was our first president. And for the first 8 to 10 years, under Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, the country grew at 5%. People of all shapes and sizes, if you know what I mean, all colors, worked together. There was meritocracy, our economy grew, there was employment, and everything worked. But then, in 2009, a man called Jacob Zuma, who had been made head of the ANC, became president of the country. And then the rot began. And from Jacob Zuma to Cyril Ramaphosa, who was elected in 2019, to today, the ANC has been in power for 30 years, and have destroyed our economy. Every single state-owned enterprise, South African Airways, Transnet, the rail network, all our ports have been bankrupted and the infrastructure broken, in many cases destroyed altogether. the ANC has been an unmitigated failure. And you raised a very good point. You said, there was a honeymoon period. South Africa was the, what's the opposite of bête noire? Was the
cause célèbre.
The cause célèbre of the Western world. The liberation of apartheid, the liberation of the people, democracy. And we really did have a wonderful 10 to 12 years of that. But now South Africa is on its knees, looking into the abyss, and it's all as a result of the ANC and its destructive, racist, kleptocratic, ineptocratic policies.
And so we'll get into some of the causes of that in a second, but I suppose just for our viewers who maybe know a bit about South Africa but aren't completely familiar with it, remind us, I suppose, but firstly of the demographics situation, and then also, well, who are the political parties? So there's the ANC, obviously, and what about the others?
So demographics go a bit like this. So about 7%, 8% of the country are white. Another 9% are what calls coloured, which is a mix of black and white. Then there is a 3, 4, 5% of Indians and other nations, and 80+% are black. But within the black community, there are 26 different languages and tribes. So the Zulus and Xhosas and Vendas and Sutus, and I can go on, all regionally positioned. And amongst the white population, there's the Anglos, like myself, and the Afrikaners. And the Afrikaners have been in South Africa for 13 generations. They're not Europeans, they're not settlers, they're Africans, Afrikaners. And so the demographics are complicated because it's not really black and white. It's very much, divisive within each group. On the political front, let me just talk about the recent national election in May 2024. For the first time in 30 years, the ANC, which has had a majority for 30 years, fell below 50% and got to 41%. Second, the Democratic Alliance, which is a party that I vote for and support, which is more centrist, free market, rule of law, democracy, got 21%. And then the MK party, which is Jacob Zuma's populist party, hard left, got 15% from nothing. He set the party up 6 months before the election and got to 15%. And the EFF, which is the fascist far left, calling for kill the Boers, kill the farmers publicly in stadiums of 100,000 people, got 7%.
Shoot to kill the mother, kill the poor, the farmer.
So it is a complicated situation. However, the ANC decided, in order to retain its power, to team up with the Democratic Alliance and some smaller parties. And that government, formed in May, is called the Government of National Unity, GNU, which in the last 7 months has done nothing, has gone sideways. So we are in a position right now where our state-owned enterprises are broken. Since 1994, on every single metric, education, health, employment, we have gone backwards. We have the highest unemployment rate in the world, and of 38%, and our youth unemployment is at 60%. It's not in good shape. In fact, it's staring into the abyss.
Indeed. So let's get on to some of the contemporary politics in a minute. But you mentioned kill the Boer there.
Yeah.
That's something that you do occasionally see online as sort of a depiction of the state things have come to in South Africa. And you sometimes will hear sort of denials of the significance of this from publications such as the New York Times, saying, it's sort of just rhetoric, it doesn't really mean anything. But I mean, this is quite significant. I mean, this is calling for violence, right? How does that play out in South Africa?
It's terrifying, and it's hate speech to the extreme, and it's real. I don't think in any country in the world people will be allowed to publicly, in football stadiums with 80 to 100,000 people chanting, to kill one of the racial groups in the country and be allowed to get away with it. But the New York Times and the BBC, I think, are still caught up in the 1994 South Africa's amazingly survived apartheid, this wonderful liberation group called the ANC is in charge. They are behind the times. It's turned badly against our country. And these are terrorists. These are dangerous, evil people.
you mentioned the BBC there, so I know you've recently been interviewed by the BBC World Service. And, well, it was funny because you were introduced to that interview as a critic of the government, so I'm not quite sure what they were expecting, but you came on and said, as you've been saying, you know, the racist government, they're doing extremely poorly in all manner of ways, and yet, as soon as you said that, you were told that this was inflammatory to say it.
But let's talk about the ANC. The ANC got just over 40%.
Sorry. You've made a lot of quite inflammatory claims about the ANC.
Correct.
South Africa is a democratic, a constitutional democracy. There have just been elections. Why is it for America to set the domestic policy of another country, a sovereign state?
They're not setting the domestic policy.
But
America
you're
gives
saying
America gives a lot of aid to
you're
South
saying
Africa.
that they are right to be doing what they're doing, and you're saying that they need to be changed. But why is it for America to set that?
America gives a lot of aid to a lot of countries around the world. Aid is a gift. Why should America continue to give aid, a gift, to South Africa to plug holes that the ANC government has made? If my comments are inflammatory, take a look at what the ANC has done to this country over the last 30 years. It has destroyed the economy. I would say that's inflammatory and not my comments.
What do you make of the unwillingness of liberal media internationally to kind of recognize how much of a basket case South Africa is becoming?
I think it's terrible that this journalist, this female journalist, even had the affront to challenge what I was saying. And I think she's from another era. And interestingly, the senior editor of the BBC, Owen Clegg, called me the next day to apologize. He actually said our journalist should not have done that. That was rude. And she was forcing her propaganda on me. But I fought back. I pushed back. I didn't allow her to do it. I mean, she should be fired. I didn't even get her name. But the BBC and the New York Times and the leftist media and the mainstream media are still touting their evil, woke virus mindset. And it's just a form of cultural Marxism. But their ratings are falling apart, as you can see in America. And hopefully the BBC will disappear at some point. The sooner the better, in my view.
So one of the similarities between politics in South Africa and here, or in the West more broadly, although no longer in America actually, is, so we have DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, and this is various things to various people, but what it broadly means is affirmative action and other measures to, tending towards racial quotas. And in fact, in the last election, it was in the Labour Party's manifesto to have a Race Equality Act, which is mandating basically reporting on, but also actually targets for ethnic pay gaps within companies. And so there's a rather stronger manifestation of that in South Africa, which is called Black Economic Empowerment. And I think that also includes government contracts earmarked particularly for black firms and things like this. But just tell us a bit about what BE has done to South Africa.
So Donald Trump is basically looking at South Africa as DEI as a country. And what DEI really is anti-meritocracy. It's forcing companies and institutions to hire on a race-based basis. And the ANC within South Africa, there are 140 race-based anti-white laws in operation. 140. The most recent being, the most terrifying of all, expropriation without compensation. If you were a foreign investor, would you even go near a country that had expropriation without compensation? And it's not land. They can take the watch off your arm. And it's been signed into law by Cyril Ramaphosa 10 days ago. But BEE isn't really DEI. BEE is Black Economic Empowerment. It started off with, if you do any business with the government, 30% of your business had to be owned by previously disadvantaged. Well, previously disadvantaged used to mean everyone but white people. But what BEE really means now is not for whites, not for coloreds, not for Indian South Africans, and not for certain black tribes. It's entirely for the ANC and their gangster cadre friends. It's become a form of mafia-style expropriation, and it's getting worse. The rules are getting harder and harder. They've even brought BEE down to companies with more than 51 employees. Law firms, real estate agencies have to private companies have to be 30% owned by blacks.
Even if
Starlink,
even if they're not listed.
even though they're not listed, that's what they're trying to push through.
Right.
Starlink, Elon Musk's extraordinary company, is in all the neighboring countries in South Africa, Zambia, Mozambique, Namibia, Botswana. And it's not in South Africa because Elon Musk refuses to allow Starlink to go to South Africa if he has to give up 30% of his company to some person on the basis of a racist law. So BEE is just one of 140 racist, destructive laws in South Africa. We are massively overregulated. It's becoming increasingly difficult to do business. And I'm not sure why any foreigner would ever want to invest in South Africa.
And so, I mean, so you mentioned Elon Musk there, probably the most famous South African in the world, and obviously very much linked to the White House at the moment. But let's stay with him for a second. Well, what do you think his perspective is on South Africa? I mean, I don't think, obviously, he doesn't approve of BEE and things, but how does he see any hope in turning things around?
That's a very good question. So the real reason Trump has turned his attention to South Africa is not Elon Musk, in my view. It's people like extraordinary patriots like Gary Player and others who've been friends with Donald Trump for a very long time, the golfer. And he has been talking to Donald Trump about what is going on in South Africa. And Donald Trump has realized we've been giving South Africa aid, support. American businesses employ almost 500,000 South Africans. There's a massive trade deficit between South Africa and BRICS and a trade surplus with America. A country that has that situation should be bending over backwards to be nice to a country that has a trade surplus with America. And I believe Donald Trump has turned his attention on South Africa because he's just disgusted by the ANC, as he should be, and pulled the aid. But Elon Musk, you ask, I think he doesn't really believe South Africa has a chance, because somebody spoke to him 2 weeks ago and reported back to me. They said to him, it was a moment walking on a golf course, and Elon doesn't play golf. And this friend of mine said, Elon, do you think South Africa stands a chance? Do you think anyone should be bothering and caring about South Africa? And Elon thought deeply. He goes quiet and you see he's thinking. The clogs, they're turning. And he said 3 words: demographics don't lie.
Clearly.
And I just think, we're heavily outnumbered. There are too many poor, hopeless, homeless, undereducated, impoverished people on social grants. We have 22 million people, population 60, 22 million people relying on government grants.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we get out of a hole like that? So I think Elon fundamentally believes South Africa doesn't really stand a chance. We're heading into a socialist, racist abyss with no hope. It is very worrying right now.
Yes, and so in terms of that recent action by the US government, so suspending aid and some other measures as well, that was described as being because of, quote, unjust racial discrimination with the expropriation laws. And this, in some Western media, was kind of denied. And they said, well, no, they only do it with certain qualifications and whatever. But I mean, what's the reality of that?
The reality is it's about as bad as it could be. Today, a few hours ago, for the first time ever in the history of South Africa, the budget statement was recalled. They didn't hold it. They're delaying it for 2 weeks because the finance minister, an ANC finance minister, had not conferred with his parties and other parties in the GNU and announced, or was about to announce, a 2% addition to that value-added tax and significant increase in taxes. And for the first time, the non-ANC members of our GNU said no and drew a line in the sand. So it's been withdrawn. It never happened before. And it's going to be budgeted and be represented in 2 weeks. This thing's unraveling at a rate of knots. And I think the rand, which is at around 20 to the pound, is going to 50. Wow. I think the rand is going to plummet.
And do you foresee the collapse of the present government?
Here's my worry. The GNU's main priority is to keep Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema, the racist, hardcore leftists, out of power. That's its main priority. Its secondary and tertiary priorities are economic growth and security and crime. And they haven't even focused on those two. So what sort of country do we have where the government's only real priority is to keep other people out of power?
Right.
We're in very, very worrying times. And the world is beginning to shift against the left, against woke, against DEI, against CRT and these evil forms of leftist and net zero, which is insanity. But in South Africa, we're going the other way.
And just, I suppose, sketch for us a little bit more. So you're not a fan of the ANC, but Zuma and Malema are even worse. What are the, if you can, why are they worse? What are the differences there?
Well, Malema of the Economic Freedom Fighters, which has nothing to do with economic freedom, and his Red Berets, wants to slit the throat of whiteness. His quote, you go online, you'll hear him say, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, kill the settler, one bullet, one settler. We want to slit the throat of whiteness.
But we are starting with this whiteness. We are cutting the throat of whiteness.
And that's Julius Malema.
Yeah.
He's got 7% of the vote. At 15% is Jacob Zuma, who pillaged the country. He absolutely pillaged the country by putting cadres into positions of power and rediverting capital, stealing money, which has all ended up in the UAE. So those two are waiting in the wings. And if the Democratic Alliance, Patriotic Alliance, and the other non-ANC members of our government walk out, the ANC could go to MK, and then we've really got a problem on our hands.
Right. And so, of course, one of the measures that Trump offered in his announcement recently was potential asylum for Afrikaners.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose maybe will that be necessary, but will many of them be inclined to take that up?
So I believe over 20,000 people applied for this refugee status in a matter of 48 hours at the embassy. They couldn't process the act. But these are usually young people and graduates and talented people. I don't think this was meant just for Afrikaners, for the cultural tribe of Afrikaans-speaking whites. I think it was aimed at anyone with dynamism, potential, talent, that had realized they had no chance whatsoever succeeding in South Africa. America said, we'll open our doors to you. And I jokingly say that Australia and New Zealand should do the same thing, because it will increase their IQ by 100%, and certainly they'd have better rugby and cricket teams overnight. But it is worrying. A lot of Afrikaners, most Afrikaners won't leave. They're not from Europe, they're not from America, they're not colonialists, they're Africans, as am I. I don't want to live anywhere else.
Right. But so just illustrate for that for us a little bit more, if you would. So there's Afrikaners, which is obviously descended from mostly Dutch settlers, but of course are mostly of Anglo heritage.
Correct.
So, which is greater, I suppose? It's
60% Afrikaners, 40% Anglos.
Right.
But we're very cohesive now. I mean, we had 2 Boer wars where the Boers fought the Brits.
Right.
And then there was not much union in the First World War, even though we fought alongside England, and the Second World War was much more cohesive. But the English South Africans and the Afrikaner South Africans are working much, much closer together. So the offer by Trump, I think, is not just for Afrikaans speakers. It's for anyone of any color that believes they can't progress in South Africa. And if I was a school graduate or a university graduate, I would leave South Africa. I would go to Britain or America immediately. I see no upside right now in South Africa for young people.
And so in terms of what is causing the problems, one of the, I would say, relatively naive ways that the problems with multiculturalism in this country, in the West more broadly, are understood is to say, well, it's about identity politics and it's about woke, but this is more or less conceived as an ideology that if one sort of just stopped talking about it, would go away. And well, so would you characterize what's going on in South Africa, the racist policies of the ANC and others, as in a way, is this woke or is this more actually just straightforward ethnic conflict and tribalism?
So you'd be surprised about how much cohesion there is in South Africa. South Africa is a Christian country. 85% of South Africans are Christian. Church-going, conservative. There is still the power of the tribal communities. And South Africans tend to be peaceful and work together. The whites, blacks, coloreds, Indians of all shapes and sizes have actually worked together and had a very good relationship for a very long time. The ANC is trying to create the racial divisions. Here's how it works. if you have a functioning democracy and functioning economy, it's hard to steal. But if you have a vast majority of the country unemployed, undereducated, hopeless, and reliant on social grants, you control the country. It's malevolence to the nth degree. And then you overlay it with incompetence, you break the economy, you control the people. Then this is a 1950s Soviet playbook in action. And the ANC was founded on the basis of a national democratic revolution, NDR, and RET, radical economic transformation. It's been in their manifesto from day one to nationalize land, banks, mines. And they're in the process of doing it.
To go back a second, I think, so you illustrated for us a bit, in your first answer, the scale of the social problems and the infrastructure problems, I think. But you could tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, in this country, we are sort of, by our own incompetence and short-sightedness, creating our own energy problems with net zero, but more or less deliberately, where we don't really have to. Whereas, I mean, you've already been having rolling blackouts for several years now. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Correct. So Eskom, the Electricity Supply Commission, was firstly run by incompetence and secondly by gangsters. There was the cable mafia, the coal mafia, the diesel mafia. I'll give you a little example. If things are functioning, it's hard to steal. If things are broken, it's easy to steal. So what they did was buy inferior coal, which would break the turbines, which would force emergency import of diesel. The sellers of the low quality coal were charging at the higher prices. They were the coal mafia. And the people importing diesel who were benefiting from the breakdown of the turbines were the diesel mafia. They were all making their money. Eskom is bankrupt. We've had load shedding, which means 2 to 6 hours of no electricity in the country a day. It's resolved for the moment, but only because the economy is not growing. Our economy is growing at less than 1%, and unemployment's increasing. I'll take the airline industry for a quick example. Zuma appointed a school teacher to head the airline who had never even been on an aeroplane. This is what they did. They redeployed money, they stole. South African Airways went bankrupt. It was the pride of Africa, one of the best airlines in the world, has disappeared. Fortunately, private airlines stepped into the breach, so we're flying on FlySafair and Airlink. So for people who use aviation, it's been privatization by default. But it's a destruction of an airline that is just tragic. And the rest of our infrastructure has been destroyed or broken. The one difference is, if you're in the Western Cape, Cape Town and the Western Cape, which is run by the Democratic Alliance, it's almost palpable. As you cross from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape, you go from roads with potholes in them to beautiful highways. Right. So the Democratic Alliance can run the country. The ANC can't. And there's a big call now for the secession of the Cape, for the Cape to secede from South Africa, which, the way things are going, has gone from impossible to improbable.
Is that what you'd want?
I think we need to try and save all of South Africa. And I think we need a crisis sooner rather than later to precipitate that, where the phoenix can rise from the ashes. We're being boiled in a pot like a frog, and the temperature's got a little too high.
Yeah. I suppose one of the parallels here that it's been to some extent memory hold in the Western canon almost is Rhodesia, which was once known as the breadbasket of Africa and is now Zimbabwe. Is South Africa going the same way as Rhodesia?
South Africa is going in the way of, at the moment, Argentina, and not yet Zimbabwe and Venezuela. So Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world in the 1920s. There were Harrods in Buenos Aires, and socialism over 90 years destroyed their economy. Javier Milei came in. I don't think we have the ability to survive that length of time, because this socialism has been 30 years in the making and is now being imposed on us rapidly. Zimbabwe also had 2 tribes and a very small population of white people, and the one tribe wiped the other out, murdered the other, and then removed the whites off the farms. South Africa, as I've mentioned, has 26 different black tribes, 2 white, and there's no tribe or community that can that could even do a coup d'etat for the whole country. In Natal, KZN, near Durban, when there were the riots 3 years ago, the riots spread in that area and a bit in Johannesburg, but didn't touch the rest of the country. So it's highly unlikely there can be a coup d'etat or that civil unrest will burst across the whole country.
And so finally, we're coming up on time here, but I suppose my question is, well, clearly it's quite a dire situation in South Africa. Is the twice is the average white South African, or maybe all of them, aware of the peril they're in?
Very much so. There have been farm murders over the last 15, 20 years that have been horrific, which the left and the left media has tried to ignore. It's 3 times as likely as a farmer to be murdered in South Africa than a policeman. And a policeman is twice as likely to be killed or murdered than a civilian. The most dangerous job in South Africa is a farmer. And it's not just farm murders. They've been tortured, raped, most horrific stories. And it's not just white farmers. It's farmers of all colors. But it's horrific what's going on in South Africa, and people are scared.
And, just a very final quick comment. What needs to happen to turn things around?
So I don't think internally we're going to be able to find any solution politically or internally. I don't think people will rise up. I think we need an external crisis to precipitate the ANC surrendering and withdrawing racist policies and having a Damascene moment and saying, this isn't working. Socialism doesn't work. And like Sweden did in 1992, say, we've got to go the other way. Let's focus on free markets and have our Javier Milei moment. But we need a Javier Milei.
Right. Okay. Well, Rob Hersov, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you.